We're going to talk about subordinates today, but before we do that, I want to hand out a few little things that'll just get you, they're just kind of general informational sheets. Start one on this side. This is how people got wounded during the Civil War. I've got one on how big soldiers were during the Civil War. I'll start. This is only Federals. We don't have records for Confederates, but they're probably almost exactly the same. That's two. Here is what soldiers ate. Union soldiers, again, everything's Union soldiers. So if you're a Confederate, you're not eating quite as well. And then one just general sheet that really isn't directly applicable to Gettysburg, but just on numbers and resources for each side during the war. So you should each get 4 things there. And then I'm going to give you a little brush with material culture from the mid-19th century, so you can have some other things in mind as you walk around the battlefield with the Marines. Everybody take one of these. Everybody gets one piece of hardtack, which is the basic Union bread ration. Baked exact. This is a year old, so it's a little softer than it should be. But it's nice and hard. That doesn't make even the smallest dent in it.
I do like what's included.
Gary, you can tell more Union rations.
Union, this is it. Save this. Don't eat it. You'll need it this weekend. Thank you. Thanks. And I want to show you, if you look at your handout that says by the numbers, wounds analyzed, I'm going to pass around examples of the things on that sheet that will let you see. We've talked about mini balls in here and how they were different from, I'm on the wrong side, I remembered. This is a musket ball. It's round, as you might expect, hence ball, it's called. That would have been fired from a smooth bore. And that gave way to these, which is called a mini ball. Shouldn't be called that. It should be called a Burton bullet, because it's an improvement on the French Claude Minier version of this. This is by an American who worked at Harper's Ferry named Burton, who gives us this. We've talked about why it worked this way. It has a hollow base that when it's fired, it's a little bit smaller than the bore of the musket that I'm going to get in just a second, so that it could load easily. The weapon's fouled easily. This allowed you to load a rifle musket as fast as you could a smoothbore musket. When you fired it, the thin back end of it enlarged to engage the grooves, and then you got the advantages in terms of speed of loading a smoothbore with the extra distance and accuracy of a rifle. So I'll pass a mini ball around each way and a musket ball each way. Michael, everything starts with you. Tremendous amount of responsibility you have. And Caroline has the same over here. Mm-hmm. There are 4 kinds of artillery rounds during the Civil War. You should keep this in mind when you're at Gettysburg. There's a solid shot, which is just a solid iron round. There's what's called a shell, which is a hollow iron round filled with powder with an internal fuse. It's made to detonate in the air with the fragments coming down, not explode on contact with the ground the way they do in all the movies. And they would break into pieces like this. And this is what would come down into the infantry. So this is a shell fragment. This one's from Antietam. An awful ugly thing. I'll put a much smaller one going around this way. Michael, are you up for this? Another one of the rounds on your sheet is canister. This is what infantry feared more than anything else. It was a little tin container filled with these iron balls. When it fired, the container fell apart, and you had these iron balls coming out in a pattern like a shotgun. It had a very distinctive sound. The soldiers in their letters tried to approximate the sound of canister. This is effective from about 400 yards in. So this is the last kind of round the artillerist would resort to in the face of a frontal assault. This is a piece of canister. This one is from Chickamauga. And I'll show you one last thing here, and that is what happened to a mini ball when it hit anything hard. And this is one reason why there were so many amputations. When it hit a bone, it just turns into a mushroom shape like this, which made hideous wounds that the medicine of the time could do nothing to fix, basically. All right. This is the basic infantry weapon for both sides during the American Civil War. It's .58 caliber rifle musket, and the mini balls that are being passed around are what you would fire out of this. I'm going to pass this around too so you can get a sense of how much it weighs. It weighs about 12.5 pounds. And it is long. Average soldiers 5 feet 7 or so in the Civil War, maybe a little bit more than that. If you put a bayonet on the end of this, it's considerably taller than most of the soldiers from the Civil War would have been. So there you get it that long. I'm 5'9", it's a lot taller than I am. And you would not, on a firing line, generally have the bayonet on it, as I'm sure most of you know. And you'd have it in an assault, but you almost certainly wouldn't use it. You can see from the percentages there, the percentage of bayonet wounds is statistically insignificant during the Civil War. The two things that make this much more effective than the weapons from the American Revolution, for example, are number one, that it's rifled, that we've talked about a lot, so the effective range is 250 yards maybe instead of 100. And the other one is that you don't have a pan on the side with powder in it. We talked about the expression flash in a pan was the powder flashing in the pan of a musket. This has a nipple on the side that accepts a percussion cap. This little piece of copper with just a very small amount of fulminate of mercury in it. Doesn't weigh anything, but it's much more waterproof than any of the earlier ways to ignite powder in a musket. And so you just put that percussion cap. You'd have a cap box. You'd have a little leather cartridge box on. If you're an infantryman, you'd also have a cap box that had the percussion caps in it. This is on half cock. This hammer is. The expression, he went off half cocked. If it's half cocked, you can't fire the weapon. That's where that expression comes from. If you go to full cock, then of course you can. So now I need a volunteer and Michael volunteers. You can be the first one to fire this. There's not a round in it, of course. All you're going to hear is how loud the percussion cap is. There's the percussion cap, and that's your souvenir of the class. The shot, not the musket. That would be one hell of a souvenir. Anybody else want to do that? I have a few more. If anybody else wants to try, please come up.
Okay.
There you go. Here's a cap. Now, what have you done wrong already?
Uh-oh. I need to fire now, don't I?
Well, no, you just hold your thumb on here. Do this.
Okay.
Now, you've already been demoted. Here you go. So put it on half cock.
Okay.
There you go. He is not going to fire 3 rounds a minute, as I'm sure you figured out already.
There we go. All right, now
And don't aim it at anyone you know. There you go.
Nice.
Nice, yes. Good job. Has a sight, as you will see. But for the most part, the soldiers wouldn't even have used those. Anybody else? We've got a couple of more minutes. If anyone, I'm very disappointed in the women in this class. Not one. Pardon? No, you won't do it. You can't do it wrong.
Chris did something wrong.
Here you go. That's why you won't. Oh, there you go. Here's your percussion cap. It's already on half cock. So you can just plunk that on. So, just like that. There you go. Push it down. And I'm going to get behind you. And then bring it to full cock and then shoot.
What's full, like this?
Pull it back. There you go. There you go. Take this with you. Okay. I saw one other. You had your hand up twice, Rob. Do you want to come and do this? You're calling somebody or texting them.
He's trying to set up a picture.
Here you go. There's the cap. There's the musket. And for those of you who didn't do this, I'll send percussion caps around both ways too. And another triumph. There you go. Caroline, send this around, the last thing that's going around. For every round, you would get your every cartridge was individually wrapped in paper. So all the untold millions of cartridges during the Civil War were wrapped one by hand, many of them by young girls whose fingers were considered small and therefore especially well suited to wrapping cartridges. The soldier would bite the end of the paper off, which is why you had to have your front teeth to be an infantryman during the Civil War. Pour the powder down, put the round down. This is what's this called? Very good. Camp. And if you're on the firing line, sometimes you would just put this in the ground like this so it's near you and you wouldn't replace it every time. The regulations say you replace it every time. There are all these very distinct movements according to the regulations on how you're supposed to fire your musket. But anyway, you get all that set, and then you put the cap on, and then you fire it, and then you do it again. And as we talked about earlier, and you may remember, I lied. Here's the last thing that's going around. I think that a veteran infantryman probably fired 2 times a minute with this, unless under real duress, when you might try to fire more than that. You didn't have unlimited ammunition, first of all. You might have 40 rounds or maybe 60 rounds going into a fight. If you're firing 3 times a minute and you only have 40 rounds, you're not going to have ammunition for very long. But at any rate, 2 times, that is considered a pretty modern weapon at the time of the Civil War, even though there were repeating weapons. But it's just before a revolution in weapons when you will get what we would consider a modern cartridge and smokeless powder instead of black powder. It's right on the cusp before there were going to be big technological changes. But that's the one that almost everybody that you'll be talking about at Gettysburg would have carried. There were a handful of units that still had smooth bores, but not very many. All right. We'll start, as we always do, with cleaning up. Michael, you have a question.
Yeah, because you were just talking about it. At what rank did an officer get a sidearm?
All the officers have sidearms. All the officers have sidearms. And they would not have been carrying shoulder weapons. Anybody? Now, any questions left over from what we've done thus far? These are not used to stick people very often. They're used for lots of other things, however. They're very handy. They are perfect tent pegs. They are good to put fat bacon on the end of and hold it over the fire. And they're perfect, and I forgot to bring my candle holders. Stick it in the ground, put a candle in there. A bayonet is very useful for that. This is a Union one. Most of the bayonet scabbards were leather. This one happens to be metal, and it's Union, we can tell, because it has a US on it, unless it was captured by somebody, and it wasn't. Now, any leftover business? Yes?
I had one question. We spoke last time a lot about how Lee should not have gone and attacked on day 2.
Yes.
Because they had a good position, they could have just stayed there. So, do you think they should not have entered Pennsylvania itself and just kind of been on home territory and just let just kind of kept defeating the Union Army that kept coming in?
So just let Lee keep, in other words, not take the aggressive at any
Yeah.
point? I think that they had that opportunity because Lee was taking the aggressive. As I said last time, I mean, who is the onus really on once Lee is in Pennsylvania? Who is under the gun?
Yeah, but our question is, why even go to Pennsylvania then? Why not just be in Virginia and...
Oh, okay. Why go to Pennsylvania? We talked about that a little bit. Why? There are three main reasons that Lee went to Pennsylvania. Kenny?
The resources and
Logistics
Yeah.
is huge. And what about logistics?
so they're not like taking away the resources from the South and being on the land, just destroying the land in Virginia.
That's half of the reason. What's the other half?
Taking supplies from the mountain.
Absolutely, siphoning things out of this untouched Pennsylvania countryside. All right, so logistics are really important. What's the second one? What does Lee fear more than anything else, Mark? Siege. How does this avoid that?
Well, because he knows that the North needs to get a victory against his army. And if he's up in gallivanting around Pennsylvania, the pressure's going to be on them to go find his army. And
He's dictating the action rather than just waiting. His argument was that if you're inferior to your opponent, the worst thing to do is just sit and wait for your larger opponent to pick their moment and their place to project their greater power. That one way to help offset the greater power of the United States was to be the one who's dictating the action and forcing your opponent to respond to what you're doing rather than just waiting. He won a great victory at Chancellorsville. He won a great victory at Fredericksburg. And what was the long-term military impact of that? Not psychologically, but military impact. Lee would have said, none. Not would have said, he did say. He said, we didn't gain anything by this battle. Here we are. We're still here. I'm on this side of the river. They're on that side of the river. We've had a big battle. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. So they fought another big battle there at Chancellorsville, and he decided then to reorient the war, to take it north. And the third reason, so one of them is logistical, one of them is maintaining the initiative, and Michael?
Political pressure on Lincoln.
Political. As we said, this is the worst time of the war, really, in terms of how virulent the Democratic opposition was to the Republican Party, and it was fueled by conscription and emancipation. Lee was perfectly aware of that, and he believed that and he was right, that getting the biggest rebel army into the United States would vastly complicate the political situation for Lincoln. Anything bad for Lincoln is good for the Confederacy, is how the Confederates look at it. Anything that helps the Democrats helps the Confederacy. And he believed that the presence of his army would do that. So those are the three main reasons. He mentioned there are other ones, those are the principal ones. Anybody have anything else? Emily?
I had a question about the use of spies. At
Mhm.
the beginning of Killer Angels, it talks about the spy that lost.
Harrison the spy, yes.
Yeah, and I was just wondering, once they both sides arrived in Gettysburg, were spies then used then as well?
No,
Okay.
no. And Harrison shouldn't have been necessary. Why?
Well, Stewart.
That's exactly right. These are apparently put online. Is that right? I know they are because people who love Jeb Stuart have sent me nasty emails about how mean I am to Jeb Stuart, and I just don't understand what he was doing. But here's the deal. I do understand what he was doing, and what he was doing was not what he was supposed to be doing. Harrison would have been irrelevant if Stuart had been doing his job. And that's an unusual circumstance that someone such as he would play any kind of significant role in a battle like this. It's the only time in all the battles of the Army of Northern Virginia that that's the case.
Is that just part of etiquette? Like spies just weren't used, or was that?
No, it doesn't have anything to do about etiquette. It has to do with there are other ways to get that information more effectively. No, it doesn't have anything to do with etiquette. And there's this kind of romantic spy side of the Civil War, usually featuring women. Belle Boyd in the Shenandoah Valley and others and who helped out. They played a role about this big in what went on in the Civil War, but some of them became quite famous. And Belle Boyd, who was a young Virginian, she made a living for years after the war talking about and embellishing what she had done during the war. But for the most part, what we would call spies are not nearly as important as what we would call the more conventional ways of gathering intelligence. Yes, Alex?
So, you mentioned that Lee's greatest fear was getting into a siege, and that's correct, since that's ultimately what Grant
He was
did.
correct, yes.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm not so sure on is, you had mentioned last time how Lee never really won a decisive victory over the Army of Potomac. He never completely destroyed it
Couldn't.
at any point.
No.
So why, in all the years before, I mean, in the Peninsular Campaign and all those other campaigns, when he did win victories, did the Union Army withdraw when, you know, in the following year, or in the Overland Campaign, they just kept going?
Well, what you answer that, that's what this class is about. What's the key to that? Leadership. Leadership. What George B. McClellan does after a campaign is not what U.S. Grant does after a campaign. I mean, it means everything. George B. McClellan has 100,000 plus men. U.S. Grant has 100,000 plus men. And they fight battles. George McClellan actually wins the Battle of Malvern Hill and retreats. That is not even fathomable with U.S. Grant in charge. It's all about leadership, all about leadership. Which is why earlier it isn't that the United States only gets more resources at a certain point in the war. It always has more resources. That's why I think that greater resources in a fight like this are a necessary but not a sufficient factor in terms of bringing United States victory. You also need the people who will apply them the way they need to be applied. And the wild card in it, the reason that Lee doesn't have to destroy the Army of the Potomac, he can't, but he doesn't have to, because what's his real target? What's his real target in winning these victories?
He wants to weaken the political support.
It's civilian morale in the United States. That's the real target. And when you win a big victory over a much larger and better supplied United States Army, morale plummets in the United States. It did after Fredericksburg. It did after Chancellorsville. Did after the 7 days. It did, and so that's the equation. It's one step beyond what's actually happening on the battlefield. And a lot of the people, a lot of the historians who write about Lee's campaigns and criticize him as not understanding that he's bleeding his army, they actually miss. He is well aware he's bleeding his army and that he doesn't have as many men as the Union has. But he made the calculation that what it will take to win the war is to destroy morale behind the lines in the United States. The best way to do that is win big victories. It also pumps up morale behind your lines if you win big victories. It's a double positive in that regard. And it's also a tremendous gamble that in the end doesn't work out. I saw somebody else's hand up somewhere, I thought. Maybe I didn't. I know I did, but it must have been, you've lost the will to pursue that question, whoever had it. Last chance to bring up something coming into today before I just make you talk about subordinates.
I have another question.
Okay.
Sorry. So, at Antietam, I mean, Lee he could have been wiped out. And
Most vulnerable he ever was, yes. And a really dumb decision on his part to stay
Right.
north of the river.
So, what were the lessons that he took from a leadership or, a command perspective from that he applied later?
I think one lesson he took from that is that audacity wasn't punished as severely as it might have been. His audacity, which should have been. I mean, George B. McClellan had 2 chances to end the war. He really did. And to end it on a kind of non-revolutionary basis, that is without emancipation. He had it in the 7 days and he frittered it away, and he had it at Antietam and he frittered it away. And so I think that is his great legacy, other than the Army of the Potomac, which is his greatest legacy, which he built and bequeathed, hampered as it was by his command culture. But I mean, he should have won the war twice. He should have. And Antietam is the closest that a really major army in the field, not in a siege situation, but in the field, that's the closest any army came to being in a position where it literally could have been destroyed, captured, wrecked. Because it's north of the river, there's just one ford, and McClellan came within a half an hour of getting control of the road that led to that ford. And it's kind of pure luck that he didn't get it. So Lee, But what did Lee take from that campaign the lesson? I better throttle back? No, he did not. He did not. Okay, we're going to talk about subordinates today, and I don't know where we're going to go. I jotted some things down that I think are worth talking about, but let me start by just having we do this every time too, I just want some reactions. What are some thoughts that occurred to you as you went through? I know you read with exacting care all of the essays on the different subordinates here. And I hope some of you read Porter Alexander, because he's the smartest subordinate that we're going to talk about tonight. What are some things that occurred to you as you went through these readings? Luke?
I was surprised at the reading that almost exonerated Sickles. Like, he was actually doing the right thing. I mean, like, everything you hear about it is the guy was a fool and he almost got the army wiped out. And, I mean,
no, it's a very gentle handling of Sickles. What does he say is, okay, what's the basic argument?
I think the basic argument is, well, it kind of explains Sickles' side of it at Chancellorsville.
We talked about that. He gave up Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville, and bad things happened.
And so he kind of sees a parallel there of, hey, there's some great ground. Meade doesn't realize this. I'm going to take the initiative on that. And I think the other thing is, by him making that mistake, he then almost blunts, even though his corps takes a pretty good beating, it kind of breaks the wave of Lee's advance, and the rest of them don't. But I mean, that argument hinges on the fact that if, was it Warren hadn't figured out about the little round table, it wouldn't have made a difference.
Wouldn't have made a difference. What is the one thing that he doesn't really talk that much about in that article that seems to be, at least seems to me to be, Sickles' greatest vulnerability in terms of whether what he did, I mean, what didn't he do? We know what he did. He moved off Cemetery Ridge and went out to the road.
Didn't tell anyone.
Didn't tell or request permission to do it.
Well, didn't he try? I mean, it kind of alludes that he had some conversation with Meade and kind of hinted or told Warren, like, hey, I'm going to do this. And he's like, I can't tell you.
Let me put it this way, Luke. Meade had no idea that Sickles had conveyed that information to him. No, I don't think Sickles made it clear. I think Sickles saw a piece of high ground, and you'll all see it. I hope the Marines will stop you on Cemetery Ridge and stop and say, there's the peach orchard, and it's higher than we are, and it is. It's a nice high plateau out to your west and a little bit south. And Sickles saw that and probably had a flashback to Hazel Grove and imagined it full of Confederate artillery, which it was as soon as his line was thrown out of the peach orchard. So you can make an argument, and we'll get to him in a minute, but that's what struck you the most, was the defense of Sickles, of all the things that you read. Are you a convert?
No, not at all. I mean, part of it, I think, is just the fact that he allowed, and I think this is one thing that struck me with the Civil War in general, is they allow like their personal feelings towards each other to influence largely their actions. I'm not in Meade's camp. I don't trust Meade. Whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna do whatever I want because it doesn't matter. He's my boss. Like he's not.
How is Sickles different from every other corps commander in both armies?
He is a political appointee.
What isn't he?
A West Point.
He's not a West Pointer. He has, what's his military, what does he bring to the table in terms of military training? No. He's the only one who's not a West Pointer at that level of command. And so he's not part of the club. And he's a Democrat from the Tammany machine in New York City, which has its own connotations for a lot of other people. Tammany was seen as barely loyal to the United States by a lot of people. New York was seen as barely loyal to the United States, New York City. New York's mayor wanted to secede from New York in 1861 and become an open international city so they could trade with everybody and commerce would just roll along. That's what their mayor wanted to do. That was his initial reaction. He didn't get a lot of support for that, but then he quit being mayor and was elected to Congress. So there were a lot of people who thought that was just fine. Other reactions? Caroline?
Just how grumpy Longstreet was.
Grumpy?
Well, I mean, it keeps on talking about how he was so, it says grumpy a lot. But just
You're talking about Crick's essay.
Yeah.
Yeah, how would you... Go ahead.
I was going to say how it seemed like he was holding grudges against things that were done to him in the past, and he was letting that...
Can you imagine that? No one does that anymore, do they? Holds grudges from the past?
Well, it just seemed like it was, pretty high stakes to be,
It's very high stakes.
just compared to Killer Angels, how
Well,
poorly he is.
what you have in Crick's essay on the one hand and Michael Shar's novel on the other hand, those are the poles of opinion relating to James Longstreet. Shar's Longstreet is what? Give me some quick characteristics. James Longstreet is... I'm sorry, I can't, with all of you talking at once, I can't make out individual comments. James Longstreet is smart,
All-knowing.
all-knowing.
Cautious.
How about modern? He gets it. He gets how destructive those muskets are. He gets it, and Lee doesn't. Lee just doesn't understand that shoots farther than a musket did. That Lee, he's really been in a cave for a long time, and he hadn't gotten the word about rifled weaponry. But James Longstreet got it. James Longstreet, and how about James Longstreet was right? Don't you think Shara would say that? He's right. And how do we know that? Because we know everything that happened at Gettysburg. And so Longstreet was right. What does Crick say about Longstreet? Other than he's grumpy.
He moved too
What's the
slowly.
title of his essay? Titles are so important.
If Longstreet says so, it's most likely not true.
I wonder what the point of view is going to be in that. So what are some of Longstreet's attributes in that essay? Emily?
He was portrayed as being very backstabbing to Lee. I think in Killer
Not loyal to Lee.
Yeah, it made it sound like in Killer Angels that they were very close friends and they both valued each other.
Yep.
But in this essay, it made it seem like it was very one-sided, that Lee really liked Longstreet, but that was not the case.
But Longstreet didn't like Lee, did he?
Yeah.
No. He's kind of a snake, actually.
Made it seem like he was on a high horse the whole time and was kind of all-knowing and thought, or at least thought he was.
Here's something you need to know about the guy who wrote that essay, Robert Kenneth Crick, who's a very good friend of mine. He loves Stonewall Jackson. I mean, Jackson. And so, and in Bob's world, you can't really be fair to both Jackson and Longstreet. And so, everything Bob cites in there is an actual source. He doesn't make up anything, of course. He's a really good historian. So he's dug up all this wonderful anti-Longstreet stuff in there. But here's the deal. Which of those two generals did Lee camp with most often, Longstreet or Jackson? And the way I frame the question, you know the answer is Longstreet. He was with Longstreet. Why would that be? Bob would say, probably because he needed to keep an eye on Longstreet, because Longstreet was a slow marcher and kind of lethargic, and it took him forever to get going and so forth, whereas Jackson is a crisp marcher and just a perfect subordinate and so forth. No. Here's the deal. Here's your choice, and I'm going to let you vote. You're Robert E. Lee. You get to spend the evening with a guy who basically looks at his boots in the fire for 2 hours and then goes to bed. And everybody sits around or you can be at a camp where they play cards, drink, talk, tell stories, laugh. Which one do you, and Lee has a good sense of humor, which one of those are you going to choose? It would be a sentence to be around James Longstreet at night. You're sentenced to 1 week of camping with James Longstreet, Laura. That's how upset I am with you. It would be torture to be with to be with Stonewall Jackson, to be with Jackson. God almighty, of course you'd be with Longstreet. He came close to being a human being. And that would be more fun to be around. Lee liked Longstreet, liked him, trusted him, gave him a nickname. Lee only gave affectionate nicknames to 2 people in the war, to 2 subordinates, and James Longstreet was one of them. When after the hideous day of fighting at Antietam, when Longstreet came up, Lee didn't know whether he had survived or not. Longstreet came up, and Lee actually, and for Lee this is sort of so excessive that Oprah's heart would soar, he came up and actually kind of went like that, may even have touched him, and said, here he is, here's my old war horse from the field he's done so much to save. I mean, that's an incredible outpouring of emotion for Lee to do that with Longstreet. He was close to Longstreet. He liked him. He trusted him. Longstreet's his senior subordinate. But Longstreet is grumpy at Gettysburg. There's no doubt about that. So you're struck by that. Luke's struck by Sickles. What else? Any instances of nepotism in any of these essays that leapt out at you? Well, another reason to think perhaps nepotism isn't the best reason to promote somebody when you're in charge of a company, that maybe your cousin who doesn't know what to do or his nephew who wants a job. Maybe don't give that person a job. Who's our poster boy for that in this book? Davis. President Davis's nephew, who gets into a hideously awful position on the first day's fighting, which I'm sure the Marines will show you, and basically gets his Mississippians mainly and one North Carolina regiment butchered in a place called the Railroad Cut. Joe Davis should not have been a general. He's a general because he's Joe Davis. And Uncle Jefferson was happy to have Joe Davis as a general. So there's our nepotism moment in this book. What else struck any of you? I refuse to believe that nothing else struck anyone from these readings.
I was interested with Howard. I think he always gets hit so hard for
He does.
not keeping the line and for going out and going through Gettysburg and having a poor retreat. But I think he may have saved the day. I mean, he understood.
Oh, here we go. And Luke and I thought Sickles saved the day. So it's really Howard who saved the day. How did he do that?
So if you're in a good position, you can either stay there and fight. And if you stay there and fight, and if he had everyone retreat to him, surely the Confederates would attack. We spent, I think, the second class, talking about whether the Confederates
These are too complicated. I'm listening.
were silly for not having, attacked at 5 p.m. and for not keeping the battle going. But
Well, wait a minute. Now, you're talking about Howard.
Howard,
His big day is which day? It's the first day.
day one.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So I'm saying right in the beginning. Day
What-
one.
Midpoint. Anyway, go ahead.
He meets the enemy instead of retreating back to safety. And if he had retreated back to safety, surely the Confederates would have attacked. And if they had won, they would have driven the entire Union from the field of battle, and they would have had the high ground and the good ground as opposed to the.
When you get out there, you're going to walk out on the first day's field, and you're going to see Barlow's Knoll, and you're going to see Oak Hill, and the town is going to be behind you. And here's where Howard is. He's up on the high ground south. He's up on the high ground south of town. And he's normally the 11th Corps commander, but now he's in charge of the whole part of the field. So Schurz is commanding the 11th Corps, and so what you're saying he did that's very good is
not. His forces are out there engaged. Instead of having all of them retreat to the high ground and hold that high ground, he engaged the enemy away from the good ground so that when he retreated to the good ground.
he sends his 2 divisions out here, and they go out. The key person here is actually Barlow, is Francis Channing Barlow, who takes up a position on line with the almshouse, which you will see. There's a big modern building there and a little graveyard, a pauper's graveyard for those who died from the almshouse. His original line was there, and then Barlow moved out to the high ground. And so the Union line went kind of like that. When you get out there, I'm sure they'll talk about this, and I want you to pay special attention to this. Barlow was hammered for doing that without orders. Howard thought, that the Union line was going to be more like this. Barlow extended the Union line out to there, and what it did was open up Barlow's right flank, and it got smashed later in the day, as you'll see. But what I want you to do when you get out there, it's perfectly understandable to me why Barlow did that. You're going to be looking at Oak Hill when you're out there, which is full of Confederates. No Confederates have showed up over here yet, and what Barlow did, I think, was try to put a line in place that would menace Oak Hill. You get out there and look at it, it's more Barlow who's doing that than Howard, I think. I think Howard did fine. And he kept one brigade back on the high ground, which is really kind of the key thing. The divisions that came out here got destroyed on the first day.
But they're getting destroyed on the first day allowed for the Confederates to never attack Cemetery Hill. And by never attacking Cemetery Hill, the Union couldn't have lost Cemetery Hill. And at end of day one, they held the good ground.
And that's a wonderful brief for Oliver Otis Howard, and he is thankful for that. We can talk about that, and that's a good point to make. We'll come back to it. Michael?
Well, I just think, I initially agreed with you, except in thinking, and this gets to where we're talking about how much Howard was or wasn't aware of what he was doing. So like, I think in retrospect, it looks really great. Like this was all intentional, and Howard had planned it that way, so he could definitely hold Cemetery Hill. But I think when you read through the essay, whether that was his plan all along versus whether or not we retrospectively placed that upon what ultimately happened, I felt like I wasn't sure.
Well, there's something else that's happening, and that is the initial axis of the battle, as we've talked about many times. Here is McPherson's Ridge, and here's Seminary Ridge. The axis of the battle on the first day is east and west, with the Confederates coming in from Chambersburg and the First Corps facing them here. It's when Confederates showed up on Oak Hill, right on the flank of the main Union line of the Union First Corps. That's why the 11th Corps has to do something north of town, because Confederates have shown up on the exact right flank of the First Corps. If you don't get somebody out here, the First Corps is doomed. So you've got to send somebody out there. Got to send somebody out there, which he does. The key action is Barlow's, however, once they get out there. None of it would have made any difference because Confederates kept coming in farther to the east. You set up a battle line, you're the Federals, and oops, there they are. They're around my flank again. You set up another one, they're around my flank again. I don't think it would have mattered at all who was in command out there in the end, because the Confederates, just through serendipity, sheer serendipity, kept coming onto the field at just the right place at just the right time and making the different lines untenable. But Barlow got hammered for what he did there, and he also got hideously wounded out on that hill. Really awful wound that kept him out for a long time. Anyone else? Yes, Laura?
I thought Alexander was really interesting when he was talking about...
He is really interesting.
Yeah, I found his honesty very surprising when he was talking about how he was trying to not make the decision of when to get to charge, and how he just said he didn't want to make that decision and try not to do it.
I almost wrote that down. This is the lower echelon was going to get me to precisely that question, that moment that Porter Alexander talks about. What's going on in command relationships there? What's the moment on the 3rd of July? Alexander is a lieutenant colonel in charge of 150 Confederate guns because he's really smart. So all his superiors have been pushed aside and they're pouting. But he's in charge. And he and Longstreet, what's their discussion? What is Longstreet?
Because I think Longstreet passed it to him to make the decision.
Tries to.
Yeah.
What is Longstreet's rank? He's a 3-star general. And Porter Alexander is a lieutenant colonel. And Longstreet basically looks at him and says, you make the decision of whether we launch this infantry assault that General Lee has ordered. You, Colonel Alexander, make that decision. And what does Alexander say? He didn't say anything, is what he said. He said, I stood by in silence, almost embarrassing. He basically went mute because he wasn't willing to do his corps commander's job there, which was to oversee this infantry assault. That's not a lieutenant colonel of artillery's job to do that. And he wouldn't do it. But it was very tense and awkward. And Longstreet finally just nodded, and the assault went on. But he tried to shift command all the way down to this lieutenant colonel of artillery to decide whether to launch this assault that Longstreet didn't want to launch. What does Bob Crick think about that exchange? He considers that not a plus for James Longstreet. I'll save you some time. He doesn't think that's an impressive example of leadership on Longstreet's part. Why is that book so honest?
Well, because I think he says that he doesn't want to make the decision, and then he also, I think he says that it was, I guess he reflected back and said that he should have realized some things that he didn't, that he was kind of blinded by following Lee's vision.
But that's a very blunt assessment. The reason I was coming at that from a different angle, the reason he's so blunt in that book is that he wrote it for his children and he didn't think it was as a book. It was just his account that his daughter asked him to write while he was down in what was then Greytown, Nicaragua, overseeing a boundary dispute. So he didn't think anybody was going to, it's why there's a lot of profanity in it and why there's a lot of very harsh judgments of different people in it, because he didn't write it for public consumption. He only wrote it for his children and didn't think it would ever be published. So good for us. We have an account that is much more unvarnished than most writings about the Civil War because of that. That's one of the most dramatic moments in that whole book, I think. And in terms of leadership and responsibility, and a subordinate's responsibility and a superior's responsibility, and how fuzzy is that line? Let's say, what is a subordinate's role? What is a subordinate's role, ideally? Michael? This Michael, yes. I don't care what his opinion is. I want to know what your opinion is.
To execute orders.
To execute orders. So, did Porter Alexander behave correctly in that situation?
Well then no, I mean, if you're going by the exact definition. I mean,
Did Longstreet give him an order?
Yeah,
He did? What order did he give him?
to make the decision.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I would broaden that definition of to execute orders. I would say you can have an order that is to use your own expertise and judgment, given that I might
Sure.
not be there, to assess the situation.
There are different kinds of orders.
Right. I think one is direct and explicit, and one is more up to your opinion.
Other thoughts?
I think one responsibility of a subordinate is to voice your opinion. Not necessarily expecting it to be executed or implemented, but being the closest to the front lines, the closest on the ground. I think it's your job to make sure that you're communicating any information that you think is relevant and giving your opinion on the situation.
What if you're not asked for your opinion?
My personal opinion is that you should still offer it.
Still offer it.
Absolutely.
Stonewall Jackson probably would have arrested you then, because there are different ways of command. Stonewall Jackson didn't ask people's opinion. He didn't want people's opinions. So here is a more expansive view of what a subordinate's role is. I assume you all agree it's to execute your orders, your specific orders. You do X. If you have more latitude, you survey the situation and then use some discretion there. Any other thoughts?
It all comes down to, if you're going to express your opinion, the leader has to be open to it, whether it's your direct commander or the general, whoever it is. Like, there has to be a working relationship there to express that. And we see with Stonewall and Robert Lee, they're both kind of, against hearing other people's opinions and want to do their guts out for the most part.
Well, Lee's perfectly willing to listen to Longstreet's opinions. What happens after you've voiced your opinion? We're having our meeting, Brandon. We're going to have 3 tense meetings. We've had our first one. You voice your opinion. Your opinion is B. I want you to do A. I'm your commander, and I say, thanks for your opinion. We're going to do A. Now what's a subordinate's role?
Do A.
Does anybody have a thought other than that? Graham?
I mean, I think it's doing what you're ordered even when you disagree with what you're ordered.
If you're finally ordered, if you're finally told to do something.
Yeah, going against your own judgment.
What are your, you really have another option. There are 2 options there, actually. What's the other one?
Quit.
Step aside and say, I can't in good faith execute that order. You should put someone else in my place. An officer can actually do that. An enlisted man can't, at least not during the Civil War. They might shoot that person, but an officer can just say, I'm resign my commission. I'm not going to, and that's okay. But those seem to be the 2 obvious options. When you're finally told to do something, you either do it, or you say, I can't do that. You put someone else in my place who will do that. And if you decide you're going to do it, then what's your obligation as a subordinate?
I think you have to support it wholeheartedly and
Really do
continue
it.
the message
Yeah.
down the line.
That's right. At least that's I'm going to say that's my view. I'm tipping my hand here. Graham?
Well, I think what we see in Longstreet's case is an instance where he doesn't.
Well, let's just talk about Longstreet. He's sort of Banquo's ghost here at our banquet. Let's go ahead and, okay, Longstreet. He and Lee, they meet 3 times. How do those meetings go? Somebody give me a quick, what are they disagreeing about?
About attacking or not at the end of the first day. That's the big discussion.
And Longstreet says what?
He basically says we should retreat from the current position and kind of hold the ground which is more secure and wait for them to come.
His refrain always is, here's Gettysburg, and there's the high ground, a little round top and so forth. But basically it's always move around to the Union left. Disengage, disengage. It's not, it's, when you read Shara, you get a sense that, oh, let's just disengage and just swing around the Union left. What does it mean for two armies that are within, as you'll see, 600 yards of one another and can see each other, and you've got, 150,000 men there? How easy is it to just disengage and move around the other person's flank? What do you do if you disengage? You're the Federals and I'm the Confederates. You're on Cemetery Ridge and I'm on Seminary Ridge, and I'm Lee, and I say, Pete, great idea. Let's disengage. Okay, so I disengage and I want to get down there. What do I have to do to get down there? Luke?
Yourself in column and start marching.
I do. I'm going down there. Here I go. And what are you doing while I'm going down there? Does it in any way make me vulnerable to do that? To disengage and just swing around your flank? An army in motion? An army in motion? My point is, that's not something you just do and all of a sudden you're down there and now Meade is in a real difficult situation. That is, armies are incredibly complicated mechanisms, and they are encumbered with vast amounts of material and wagons and animals and everything else. So it's just, we need to keep in mind that that is a big deal, to disengage in the face of an enemy. You've already fought for one day. There have already been 15,000 casualties on this battlefield. But that's what Longstreet wants, and Lee doesn't. What would Bob Crick say about Longstreet's behavior on the second day? Let's go through the second day. Okay, it's morning. Boy, it's morning. And Longstreet and Lee meet that morning. Maybe I'm Longstreet. I'm hoping the old man has forgotten what he wanted to do yesterday, which was renew the attack. He is old. He's got gray hair. God knows he's barely holding on to his marbles. Maybe today he will agree with me. But he doesn't. He doesn't. We get together early in the morning. Lee tells me what to do. I'm supposed to go down, God damn it, down here and attack up the axis of the Emmetsburg Road, which means my line will be like that. My axis is that way, so I'll get to the high ground up by Gettysburg. That's what the old man wants me to do, and he tells me to do that about 8 in the morning. And what do? Tom? The first thing I do is ask to wait for my very last brigade to come up, which is 20 miles away. Can I wait for a Vanderlaw to come up? And Lee tells him, Lee doesn't know exactly where a Vanderlaw is, but Lee says, okay, wait. Okay, so what does that mean? What time does Longstreet actually get going? Anybody remember?
4 o'clock?
Well, that's when he finally gets into a position to attack, but he begins his march a little after 11. 11 in the morning? What time did the sun come up on July the 2nd? There's no daylight savings time. Came up a little after 4:30. 6.5 hours? 6.5 hours. It's been light before he starts his march. We're marching. Now what happens? We get to a point just past Black Horse Tavern, and we climb up a little hill. Oops, there's a little Round Top and Round Top ahead of us. Now, Porter Alexander had been there a little while earlier. And what he did was back his guns down, go about 300 yards to his right, put a little ridge between himself and the high ground, and he ends up right where he wanted to be. What did Longstreet do when he got to that point?
Go back to him.
Countermarched his entire column of 15,000 men. Back they went, the way they came, found another road, and came back. The upshot is it's 4 o'clock before they get down. So it's been 11.5 hours. Time does the sun go down on July the 2nd? 7:30. So you have spent 11.5 of your hours getting into position to launch your attack. Does Bob Crick think that's a good performance by a subordinate? What are the rest of, what do you think about this? I've already tipped my hand. Really? Give me some thoughts. Yes.
I think Longstreet was being selfish. He was kind of being stubborn, and he stuck with his own idea and didn't want to give in. And maybe he was hoping he wouldn't have to get to the line at 4 o'clock. Maybe things would have changed.
Graham?
I think it's a fundamental lack of leadership on his part, because he's then jeopardizing his own men by not executing the mission in a proper fashion. And so,
Luke?
I mean, I agree with, I just said it. I'm curious, how much did the deaths of his kids, did that markedly change Longstreet's behavior for the rest of the war?
What, if he lost his 3 children in the winter of 60? Of course it did, yeah.
Was he ever the same commander?
He wasn't. Well, I don't think it affected him it affected him as a person. It really did. I mean, he was not nearly as convivial as he had. He lost 3 children in the winter of 1860. They're all buried in one grave in Hollywood Cemetery. One headstone with 3 little parts to it. So no, that affected him tremendously. But I don't think it affected him on a battlefield. At least I can't see any way that it affected him on a battlefield. I wouldn't read anything from that into what's going on at Gettysburg. I would not. There's even another moment at which what is Longstreet? He finally gets down to the point at which where you'll also be again. So I wish I was going to be there with all of you. It would be fun. Gets down here and sees that, of course, the situation has changed because Luke's idol, Daniel Edgar Sickles, has moved off his position, and now the attacking up the Emmitsburg Road no longer makes sense because the Federals are along the Emmitsburg Road, and they have a salient at the Peach Orchard. Their line bends there, in other words. Okay, so now the situation has changed. What does John Bell Hood say to Hood is one of Longstreet's division commanders here. Hood goes to Longstreet, and this is directly apropos of the point that you brought up about, Brandon, about whether you have leeway. You have Longstreet's general instructions are go down there and attack up the Emmitsburg Road. Now he gets down there, and he sees that the situation has changed. What does John Hood say to him? John Hood is the most combative division commander in the Army of Northern Virginia. No one could ever accuse John Bell Hood of being timid or slow to go forward. The one thing that marks his entire career, from regimental to brigade to division to corps to Army commander, is heaps of casualties wherever he goes. What does he say here?
Well, he says he wants to attack a different way because everything has changed.
He says, instead of attacking here, let's go a little bit farther and we'll get all the way around the Union left flank. If we just go a little bit farther, we will get all the way around the Union left flank. And what's Longstreet's response to that?
No, we need to do what Lee said.
General Lee ordered us to do this, and so we are going to do this, and I have no discretion to change those orders, which is one big, fat, goddamn lie. And he knew it. He knew it. He had tremendous discretion from Lee. He'd always had it, just as Stonewall Jackson had always had it. He knew that he could adapt because just what you talked about had happened. He'd gotten down there. He's on the ground. Circumstances have changed. They're not at all what they were at 4:30 in the morning when Lee's staff officer rode across that ground and there weren't any Federals there. So Longstreet, I think, again there, and now it seems to me he's kind of making a point, but I'm perfectly happy to have somebody put your Michael Shara hat on and defend him here. What's the best face you can put on James Longstreet's conduct as a subordinate in a chain of command? What's the best face you can put on his leadership on July 2nd at Gettysburg? What's the best one? Tom, step up. It's a brave man who's going to do this.
Well, you could make the argument that he wanted to wait for reinforcements to come to make the attack stronger.
Well, he has all his men now. There are no reinforcements coming.
At this point.
Yep.
He marched all the way around because I think the book was saying that by marching around the enemy wouldn't see him. And so he had to march that long way to get around the left.
He said he did. Porter Alexander didn't to get to where he wanted to be. But Alexander wondered why they didn't just follow the horse droppings of the artillery horses if they wanted to know how to get around there. But never mind that.
So then you can also say, well, then at 4 o'clock when he did attack, he didn't want to delay attack, remember, moving further right because everyone else was already attacking him. So if he attacked too late, then it would kind of miss the whole coordination effort that was going on.
Well, because he's the key. Nothing starts till he starts. He is the one who starts everything. That's the other piece of this. That's why he's even more, it's even more. It's not just that he's one of several people who are supposed to attack. He attacks, and then Ewell attacks when he hears Longstreet's assault begin. So he is the key. Nothing happens till he gets going. Nothing happens till he gets going.
So if he waits any longer, they'll run out of daylight. It's already 4 o'clock and it's already 7:30. Marches further and waits till 6 o'clock, then the attack will run out of light.
Very well done, Tom. That's a good defense. Alex?
So what is Lee doing?
What is Lee doing? What should an Army commander be doing? Here's something else. Where should an Army commander be in a battle such as this? Michael?
I would think the highest ground you could possibly be to observe the entire battlefield as much as you possibly can.
What is it good for his subordinates to know about an Army commander during a battle?
Location.
Where the hell is he? So is it a good thing for Lee to be just kind of going all over the place, or should he be in a place where people can get word to him and he can, and where he is for most of the time is up somewhere near the Lutheran Seminary, which you will see. His little headquarters, his headquarters are in a field there, are right along the Chambersburg Pike. So that's where he is. He rides a little ways out in different directions, but that's basically where he is. That's where he is. Graham?
Going back to Tom's thesis, and I see why.
Oh, I put Tom under the gun there.
It's not. I think it's funny because if Longstreet had wanted, he had a pretty good opportunity there to deliberately delay it another day, and so he could have then taken his case back to Lee to try and prevent the attack even further. And it was almost sabotage at this point to attack the way he did, just to prove his own point. And so it's funny that he probably had a window there to delay a day and chose not to take it, given where the fight was going.
Brian?
Based on the Crick article, though, that would assume Longstreet's going to take responsibility for his actions, and based on the argument is he usually finds a way to push that responsibility off on someone else. So at the point when he does attack, knowing he might fail, he doesn't need to take the blame for it. So if he decides to go around, it's then him as the corps commander deciding to do that instead of saying, hey, listen, I just followed these directions and I had to do it.
Except you could have blamed the movement of the Union troops and say, well,
it still would have been his movement, though.
I don't know if he can blame the Union troops.
Well, no, but he
for
could have
his
said it.
failure.
Well, I didn't have a choice. I had to move around, ran out of daylight. I'm sorry. It's like he wanted to fail. That's what it seems like.
I guess just to take the counter to that, I think when we talked before about is it your duty after you go back once to just go and do it the right way? Well, we go back twice, and you go back 3 times, and you're turned down 3 times. I think he was in a position that at 4 o'clock he did have to attack, because the line to 6 is even further saying, you told me 3 times no, and I'm still disagreeing with you. I know it looks like the right decision, but when you hear no 3 times, I think it's significantly harder to make a counter decision than when you just heard it once and said, okay, I'm going to do it, but if something changes, we'll make an adjustment. I know it's not a good excuse, but I think it definitely hits your psyche when your boss tells you 3 times that you can't do what you're now being asked to do.
Or to put it another way, your boss tells you to do something that you don't want to do. In terms of pushing it off on someone else, that's what he's doing with Porter Alexander. He's trying to push responsibility on the 3rd off on someone else, whether or not to make the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. It's a measure of how well Lee thought of him that the Pickett-Pettigrew assault, fewer than half the soldiers are Longstreet's in that assault. Most of them are from A.P. Hill's division. But Lee didn't trust A.P. Hill at all, and obviously didn't think July 2nd was enough of a reason not to trust Longstreet on the 3rd. It also is a very good lesson about not having options. If you're trying to find someone to do something, and you have a pretty good read on most of the people who are working for you, and you sometimes just find yourself picking the least potentially negative option. Not an ideal one. I don't have an ideal one. But Ewell is in the wrong place. Hill is out of the question. That leaves Longstreet. leaves Longstreet. And you hope for the best in that situation. So Sickles, I want to come back to Sickles for just a minute. Sickles for just a minute. You're in a position, there's a lot on the line, and somebody who works for you, you think you have a good sense of what's going on, and somebody who works for you has done something that completely throws off everything else that you're doing and forces your entire attention to making everything else conform to what that person has just done. Because if you don't, you might have a catastrophe on your hands. What is your, put yourself in Meade's skin here, what's your reaction going to be to that?
I would obviously be pretty angry, but I just wonder to what extent Sickles understood how important that position was.
Which position?
His first position. He was supposed
What
to
does he know about his position? What is his position? Here's the Union line. Oh, let's use this one again. Here's the Union line. There's Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge. Little Round Top's empty, Round Top's empty. So the Union, here's Culp's Hill. So the Union line goes sort of like that at that point of the battle. Who is right here? Our boy Dan Sickles is. So what he does know about his position is he is the left of the Army. He's the left flank of the Army, and he's going to go, here's the Peach Orchard, there's the Emmetsburg Road. So when he goes out here and sets up this line, what's the problem with that line? It's not in contact with any other part of the Army, which is a problem. It's also vulnerable, as all salients are, from more than one side. From more than one. When you stand at the Peach Orchard, just imagine that. Here's Little Round Top, here's Devil's Den. Sickles goes out there, he doesn't have enough men to even cover the position. So it's not by any means a strong, solid line. It's a line that a good part of which is only artillery, no infantry. You cannot do that on a Civil War battlefield. You cannot have artillery without infantry supporting your artillery. You cannot do it, and that's what his line had. Kenny?
Is he vulnerable to like friendly fire from behind?
No. That's one thing he's not vulnerable to at that point.
To what extent is this just a lack of ignorance, being a politician rather than a true...
Yeah, that would be a way to get him off the hook. He's just so damn dumb that he doesn't realize what's... I don't think he's that dumb. I don't think he's that dumb.
I mean, I think his lack of communicating efficiently with the people behind him is a problem. But I mean, I think a lot of blaming him in a way is you have to stand where he initially stood.
You do?
And look at the Peach Orchard and realize that it's above you. And if you are the left terminus of the Army, and if the Confederate troops that you know are amassing to your far left, which position is in fact better? And I think if you're a superior in that instance, you have to say, if I were Sickles, would I have done the same thing he did or not? And if not, then to what extent should I expect him to think like I did?
Answer that. You posed two questions there, Michael. What are your answers to them?
I think he ultimately probably made the incorrect decision. The reasoning behind it, I very much understand. I haven't stood that ground specifically enough to know it, but
you will. It'll be very. There's nothing like standing on the ground. Absolutely nothing like it. When you get out there, everything is going to take on a different cast when you look at things, and that is But when you get out there, you'll also see how far you are from Cemetery Ridge. You're a long ways from Cemetery Ridge when you get out there. Luke?
So this is like a classic politician move. The position for his own unit may have been better, but for the whole Army, it was, horribly worse. And so instead of functioning as part of the whole, he makes himself perhaps slightly better, but really not. He ends up, he makes the Army worse and himself worse by separating the two. So I think you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a West Point grad to figure that out. If you're told, stand here in the line, you're the end of the line, there's no military training that tells you, well, maybe if I go there by myself, it'll be better.
It'll be stronger. No, there's not.
So, I really, it's just, to me, that's why the essay, militarily, it's just, inexcusable to do something like that. And yet, somehow, they tried to, pat it as, something that this was, a good idea, and it ended up working out in the end for him.
Well, he argued that. Yes, he certainly argued that. And And he had powerful friends in Congress. There were hearings after Gettysburg where Union generals were hauled up before congressional committees, including Meade. Meade was grilled mercilessly by the Republicans after the battle. And Sickles got a pretty friendly hearing from many people in Congress. But it's a very tough one, especially when you do it at a point where you basically leave your superior no option but to conform to what you've done. Because to try to pull back off of that ground with the Confederates going into place would, of course, have made the Third Corps extremely vulnerable, trying to get back to Cemetery Ridge. So you're pretty much locked into defending that position. And what Meade does, as we've talked about earlier, is he just pours troops from 3 other corps into that end of the line to shore up what Dan Sickles had put in place. Who decides? We spent all last time talking about Lee and Meade. Who actually dictates what happens once a battle gets going? How important are subordinates once a battle gets going? Are they really in charge? Does it become their battle? Are the Army commanders almost beside the point once it gets going? I see about 4 heads nodding.
I think they are. I think the subordinates are in charge because once the commander sets the strategy, they have to go out and follow through. And if they can't, they need to have the power to make changes based on changes on the battlefield. And I don't think that you can get those changes from a commander in time. I think you have to trust the subordinates.
How important is the element of time on these battlefields? We've talked about this a little bit. You make decisions based on information. That's what we all do. That's what you'll all do in your careers. That's what everybody we've been talking about does. You get as much information as you can get. Lee had certain information setting up the second day's fight, which is why he wanted to do what he wanted to do. How hard is it to really keep abreast of what's going on once one of these battles starts? What do you rely on? How do the pieces communicate to the center? How does the center communicate to the component parts?
And I would assume they had people that would go back and forth.
Couriers and staff officers.
And staff officers
Yep.
that would do that, and taking that into account, it would delay so much the decision that basically the people on the field were the ones making a decision. So once, as she said, once when the battle started, I mean, you don't have any real control on the situation. The commanders of the armies don't have any real on-time command. It's like a delayed decision, probably a couple of hours.
It could be that long, but it would be at least a half an hour or so, which is a long time when something's happening on the ground. A half an hour is an eternity.
I agree with that, but wasn't there an encounter where Meade did send reinforcements to different
No.
parts of the battle, so he kind of did control the overall fate?
What Meade was able to do, because he had these interior lines that we talked about, is he was able to shift people from one part of his line to the more threatened part of his line. And so he stripped Culp's Hill, as I'm sure the Marines will talk about with you, and sent those troops. One of your essays is on John Caldwell and Caldwell's division. Caldwell did a spectacular job as a division commander in the wheat field. He was pulled from farther north in the line and sent down into the wheat field. So Meade could do that. Lee couldn't really do that because he's on the outside, and so I think, but to a much greater degree, Meade can have a more hands-on effect in his defense than Lee can in his offensive here.
So we're assuming that they had reserves, both armies, in order to send, because if all of your soldiers are on the line, you cannot send one time.
That's a great question, George. And the troops who are stripped from Culp's Hill are not reserves. They're in the front line on Culp's Hill. What they do is take a position that had been defended by 2 divisions, and we know what divisions are now, and left it defended by 1 brigade. That's what they did there. And so that he really just stripped that end of his army to send it down to the other end of the field. Got a really good performance out of that 1 brigade that was left there. Really good performance, luckily, for the Union cause. how far down the structure of command does the ability to really affect things go? We've only talked about corps commanders. We talked about Caldwell a little bit as a division commander. How far down do you think this phenomenon goes? If Lee's not in charge, how much in charge is Longstreet once Hood's division and McLaws' division are engaged? How much control does Dan Sickles have over his two divisions when he takes his corps out there? I'm going to infer from you, you're shaking your head, that you don't think they...
Yeah, I mean, as the train stretches, the lack of influence and control goes away. So the farther away it gets from you, the guys in the front line, they might know from a courier, they got, word came to word came. There was a big game of telephone. It's like, well, he may have said that, it may have changed, I'm just going to take care of me. So I think the farther away they get from the front line, and the more iterations that order goes through, the less effective it is.
So what does that tell us about leadership in an army or a big organization, Brian?
I think it might have been the Caldwell essay where they were talking about like all the training that they had allowed them to perform so well at such a micro level that when they actually had to make changes and move in directions that they don't normally move in, fight in directions that they don't normally fight, they were able to do it so well because of high level training. So I think while they might not have the tactical ability to kind of point things out and make decisions at that point, taking the time to really put all that training and that drilling in to let people be ready to perform in ways that they're not normally expecting to, I think that's where you have a big influence as a leader.
Training and drilling are really important. What's the other thing that's really important in these situations?
High-level strategy and communicating what your end goals are.
Yes, that's important, but as we filter down, when you get farther and farther down in the chain of command, training is really important. What else is really important?
I was just going to say, making sure you have strong leaders at every point along the way. You can't just have a top-down.
Oh, no. Yes, that's Graham?
Is it confidence in your superiors?
It's experience. I've been in 6 battles, and I saw this happen. This happened at 2nd Manassas, this situation did, and so I'm going to react to it. I know what happened there, and there won't always be a situation that's identical to the one you're in, but there's often something that's happened that you can apply to where you are. It's why casualties among company grade officers, and what's the cliche about armies? Who are the key people in armies? What really makes an army function correctly?
The infantry, the guys on the ground.
Which guys?
The boots in the front line.
The non-commissioned officers, really good non-commissioned officers. You see that, any of you have watched Band of Brothers? You can't watch Band of Brothers without coming away with the idea, because they make sure they tell you 49 times that the key to an effective company is good sergeants. That's what you need to have. Well, it does go all the way down that far, because you get less and less and less and less direction. When you're standing on Little Round Top and trying to imagine what was going on there, George Meade might want something to happen. He has nothing to do with your world at that point. Absolutely nothing. He might as well be in Baltimore. As on the battlefield. Has nothing to do with your life. Your division commander has nothing to do with your life if you're in the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. Even your brigade commander, who's going to get mortally wounded that day, once the fighting actually starts, doesn't have anything to do with your life either. It just comes down and down. And initiative at every level that we're talking about, or lack of initiative, or right decisions or wrong decisions, at every level that we're talking about can be critical, can be absolutely critical.
Can you go over the levels, like how many commanders there are between the infantrymen and ladies?
Well, if we're all in a company, and we're about a company at Gettysburg, the regiments have 300 men in them, but there are 30 of us here more or less, we're a company. So who commands us? A captain. The captain is in charge of us. There are 10 companies in a regiment. Regiment's commanded by a colonel. So there's a colonel of the regiment, there's a lieutenant colonel of the regiment, major as we come down, those are all field grade ranks, major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel. The company grade ranks are second lieutenants and captains. Those are the company grade ranks. The people we're going to have the most contact with, our company here, we'll see our captain a lot, we'll see the lieutenants a lot, and of course we'll see the non-commissioned officers all the time. Those are the people we'll see the most of. We'll see the colonel. The colonel will make his presence known to us, but we're not going to see him nearly as much as we see our captain. And when you go, so a colonel commands a regiment, there are 4 regiments or sometimes more in a brigade. A brigade's commanded in the Confederate Army by a 1-star general, usually, a brigadier general. In the Union Army, colonels often command brigades too, because as we've talked about before, there are more levels of rank in the Confederate Army than there are of generals. So a brigadier general commands a brigade. A division in the Confederate Army is commanded by a 2-star general, a major general, often by a brigadier general in the Union Army. And then a corps, 2 or more divisions make a corps. Corps is commanded by a 3-star general, a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. That's what Longstreet is. Commanded by a major general in the U.S. Army. And then the Army commander in the Confederacy is what we would call a 4-star general and what they just call a general. Lee is a general. His rank is general. And on the U.S. side, it's a 2-star general. So 2-star generals are as high as you can get until Grant gets promoted to 3-star general in 1864. We talked about that before. It's because Washington had been a 3-star general. Congress had said no one else will ever be a 3-star general again because that would mean they're like Washington. And no one's like Washington. So Grant's the first 3-star general of real rank. And then he becomes the first 4-star general, too, in American history, which tells us how important Grant was. So you'd see your captain a lot, and you'd see your lieutenants and your non-commissioned officers a lot. It's really, I think you'll get a wonderful sense when you're on the field of what an Army commander's real job is. What things can the Army, at that level of leadership, we'll get back to subordinates in just a second, but at that level, what can Lee really do going into the second day at Gettysburg? What can he really do? His role that day. Luke?
He can apportion like support, for instance, artillery or perhaps logistics.
Yep.
He can
Before the fighting starts, he can,
supplies.
yep.
So I think, I would imagine that's one of his key decisions before the fighting starts. He can set the general strategy for how it's going to go and then provide the orders, and how much latitude he chooses to give his subordinates within those orders is part of his way of giving them freedom or restricting their freedom in acting.
Let's talk about orders. If you want somebody to do what you want somebody to do, what kind of orders should you give them? How important are orders?
Clear and concise. I mean, the ambiguity leads to people doing things on their own or not doing their orders correctly, and then all kinds of things.
That is really, that's the heart of writing an order. Grant his orders are just these magnificent, clear, unequivocal, easily understood orders. Really good, really good. Does the kind of order that you write have something to do with the kind of people who are your subordinates? How, Michael, why?
I mean, like we talked about this in the previous class. Lee, he just had a very, close relationship with Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson, and
and Jeb Stuart.
And second day aside, usually he give a lot of leeway, and they would they were kind of the same mind. They would usually execute, and so if you have that kind of relationship where it's just much more a lot of experience together, a lot of have been through a lot of battles together, then you just kind of know what to do, and so Lee doesn't need to kind of waste words giving really long specific orders, because he just knows that those 3 will do what he would have done.
He knew it until Gettysburg. That's right. It's a fascinating exercise to look at Lee's orders. Just one second, Kyle. To look at Lee's orders written in 1862 and down through the Gettysburg campaign, and then look at the orders that he writes for the people who command corps under him after Longstreet's wounded, Stonewall Jackson's dead. His orders become much more specific as he goes along. He learned. It's a wonderful example of how somebody who is how a smart leader understands the people he's leading and tailors his leadership style to the people that he has. Gettysburg's the turning point for Lee in that regard. Kyle, I'm sorry I cut you off.
I was just wondering, I understand that you manage people different depending on their perceived levels of competence, but I wonder if it's a bit of a cop-out to say that you don't need to be clear and concise with someone who's good.
Oh, no, I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
It sounds like in some of the essays and when they talk about Lee's messages
Yep.
and they talk about his leadership style, it's like, oh, well, he didn't really need to be clear and concise. And you read some of the messages and you're like, what the heck is that saying?
Take that ground if practicable.
Yeah.
That's his instruction to Richard Ewell on the afternoon of July 1st. You are now Richard Stoddard Ewell, Kyle, and you've recovered enough from losing your leg to be back with the Army, and you just got that order. What does that mean?
Do whatever I want.
Do whatever I want.
I mean, it's up to you. If it's practical, you say,
That's a better way to put it.
I'm missing my leg, I don't want to do it.
What is that telling you? That's telling you you're on the ground. You decide. I can't decide. I'm Lee. You decide whether the factors align in such a way that you can take that high ground, or they align in such a way that you don't think you can take that high ground. And what do you do as Richard Ewell?
I decided not to take it.
Are there reasons?
That you've been fighting all day and that you're missing your leg or whatever else.
No, he's missing his leg. He's doing okay with his leg. He got a mini ball hit his leg as he was going into Gettysburg, and so everybody turned around and they were worried. He said it doesn't hurt a bit to get shot in your wooden leg. But he's worried about, he's had thousands of casualties. He has thousands of Union prisoners to look after. There are reports of Federal infantry approaching on a road off to his left. And he doesn't know how many Federals are up on Cemetery Hill. Those are the things that he's dealing with there. And so his decision is, I'm going to wait for my 3rd Division under Edward Allegheny Johnson, and then I'll do something. So he did. Did he follow Lee's orders?
But I guess the question is that what Lee really meant?
No, it isn't. What does Lee's order mean?
What you mean. Like, take it unless you absolutely can't
and
take
why
it.
did he? Why would Lee send that order to Richard Ewell?
I mean, it sounds.
We know Lee's not dumb. Why would he do that?
I would go to someone.
Same order he would have sent to Jackson.
It is the same order he would have sent to Jackson, and what would have happened?
Jackson would have taken it.
Well, he would have tried to take it. I don't know
but
what.
he would have.
No, he would
He
have.
probably
Jackson would have opened that order and said, "Oh, he wants me to attack that ground." That is how. Who knows? I'm saying that. How the hell do I know what? But that is how he would have read it, and he would have tried to do it. And I think that's what Lee was still thinking at that point in terms of Ewell. What did he know about Ewell? This is another. It's intelligence and information about the people who are working under you. What did Lee know about Richard Ewell? What was his experience with Ewell? What had he seen in Ewell before the Gettysburg campaign? Almost nothing, because Ewell got wounded at Second Bull Run back on August 28th of 1862. He had fought. Where had Ewell always fought before then? He'd fought under Jackson. He'd been in the Shenandoah Valley with Jackson. He was under Jackson. It's Jackson who knew Ewell. And it was Jackson who recommended Ewell very strongly to Lee. And so it's basically Jackson's recommendation that got Ewell Corps Command. Well, what would Lee assume about someone that Jackson had recommended? He'd think he's going to be like, if Jackson approved of him, he must be aggressive, he must have initiative, he must have, you tick off the characteristics. And he was wrong. That Ewell wasn't Jackson, not even close. But I think when Lee issued those orders, he didn't know that yet. And he had the old command system still in place, the old system of dealing with subordinates. And he was going to find out in one day on July 1st that he couldn't do that with Ewell and he couldn't do it with Hill. One day he's going to find out that 2/3 of his corps commanders are not going to be the way it used to be. And Jeb Stuart isn't even here. Now, does that get Lee off the hook? Should he have sent a different kind of order? We can argue about that. I think that's why he did send that kind of order. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. He almost has to defer to Ewell's. I think if Lee's going to give him that order, then Lee can't be so upset with him later. But he clearly was. He was really upset with Ewell later, really upset with Ewell, because Ewell had been, from Lee's perspective, as Lee put it, they fought in a halting way. And he said all of his corps commanders did at Gettysburg, all of them. But he really thought Ewell did. Somebody's hand came up over here, I thought. So orders, there's not one kind of order then. There's not a template where you say, this is how I deal with subordinates. And I'm going to write it down. Here's my rule for dealing with subordinates. I'm going to give it to every subordinate so that everybody knows that this is how I'm going to deal with them in every situation. Or can you do that? Should you do that? So that everybody knows has a roadmap.
So I'm wondering, I mean, most of these high-ranking officers went to West Point.
Almost all of them.
As I said, most. So you would assume there is some kind of...
George, they read all the same stuff, every one of them.
Then, I mean, you could argue that it could be some instructions for orders. If they went all to the same
Oh
school.
yeah, no, they didn't learn that. They didn't learn much about military things at all at West Point.
Okay.
West Point's an engineering school.
Yeah,
It's an engineering. And what they do learn how to maneuver 20 guys at West Point. I mean, but in terms of, and they read about Napoleon, and they memorized some of Napoleon's maxims. They didn't get that in class. There was a Napoleonic club at West Point. If you wanted to read about Napoleon, you joined the club. You didn't get it in class, you got it in the club. And the people really interested in military things were disappointed at West Point because they didn't get much military stuff.
Yeah, so then when I was thinking about it, I was thinking the bigger issue was from those higher officers to bring the order to the lower officers, to the field officers, because those people without the school.
Yeah.
So that was, for me, was breaking point, but looks like the breaking point was in many places.
But that's a really good point that you just made, because most of the people who were commanding in all the places, you're going to see hundreds of Union regimental markers at Gettysburg. It's the biggest outdoor sculpture landscape in the world. There are more than 1,300 monuments at Gettysburg. And a huge number of them are Union regimental markers, and most of the men who commanded those regiments have essentially no military training. So your point is very much a good one. How do you write orders for people who don't know anything? Never mind writing an order for Richard Ewell. How about writing an order for Colonel Gallagher, who is a banker who wanted to command a regiment and was well connected, and so he's now a regimental commander. And he's in charge of hundreds of men whose lives depend on him, and he doesn't know anything about being a soldier. It's a citizen soldier army, including the officers. Although by the time of Gettysburg, of course, there are a lot more veteran civilian soldiers in the Army than there would have been sooner. What did those of you who paid close attention to Scott Hartwig's essay on John Caldwell. Scott Hartwig has been the senior historian at Gettysburg for a long time. He's about to retire, but he's a really good National Park Service historian, really good. He's actually more interested in Antietam than he is in Gettysburg, but he knows everything about Gettysburg. What did you take away from this essay? Caldwell is not exactly midpoint command, but he's 3 notches down from the top. What did you take away from that essay? We've talked about the culture of caution in the Army, the Potomac, and so forth, in which Dan Sickles, of course, in some ways, Dan would be more comfortable in the Army in Northern Virginia. There's a big piece of ground. I'm going to go out there, because that's a good aggressive thing to do. That's much more typical of what somebody in the Army in Northern Virginia might do than what somebody in the Army of the Potomac might do. What about Caldwell? What do you take away from that essay, if anything? May not have been the one that you spent the most time on. I'm beginning to pick up on that. And we can always move on to someone else. We're going to move on to someone else. Here's what you're going to do, because I'm going to bring it up again next week. You're going to stand in the wheat field, and you're going to hear about John Caldwell. The wheat field is this unbelievably complicated cauldron of fighting. Thousands of casualties in the wheat field in several waves, but Caldwell did an absolutely exceptional job in the wheat field in stabilizing the situation in the wheat field for the United States. And he did it by making a couple of decisions under fire that were very unusual, not textbook responses to where he was and what needed to be done, but sort of intuitively correct responses to the situation in front of him that saved time. He got his division in action in about 10 minutes, which is really a good piece of command there. Okay, we're now finished with John Caldwell. Laura, you, I can tell, read Porter Alexander, or at least parts of Porter Alexander, at least the Gettysburg part of Porter Alexander. Alexander has a really sophisticated critique of several levels of Confederate command at Gettysburg. I want to know if anyone else read it closely enough to come away with some ideas from Alexander that you think made sense or are worth talking about. It only takes me about 11 seconds to figure out what has been digested and what hasn't. I think we'll leave Porter Alexander alone, Laura. Just you and I will have a kind of Porter Alexander club here. You're really missing out. I'll say just one more time, don't throw that book away. If you're interested in this at all, sit down sometime and make Porter Alexander your friend, because he will reward you incredibly for however much time you spend with him. He's really smart, and has this detailed, unblinking critique of Lee at Gettysburg, which for a former Confederate is really unusual. Really, and the only reason, I mean, it's just the fact that he didn't think anybody would read it is one reason that he was so blunt about Lee there. But he is, it's very much worth reading. I'm not going to ask us to actually vote on Longstreet, but I'm going to ask you to tell me which officer at any level you think exemplified what you would consider the attributes of a first-rate leader. That person's behavior at Gettysburg makes me think that is a leader. That's the kind of leader that could make things happen the way they should happen. Either side, any level.
What are the options?
Pardon?
What are the options? Can we pick anybody?
Anybody.
Okay.
The options are, it's a universe of everybody. Alex?
I was impressed by Hunt.
And who is Henry Jackson Hunt?
The head of, I forget exactly his
He's
title.
the chief of artillery.
He's head of all artillery in the Union Army.
Yep.
And he's not someone I had known.
Nobody,
about.
no reason you would.
There was one, he was mentioned many times, and in several essays, but one in particular was about him.
Yeah.
And I just thought, for someone who didn't command an actual corps, but he had a role in almost everything that happened.
Because there are guns everywhere.
Exactly, and his ability to anticipate what was going to happen. He was literally writing everywhere.
He was.
I thought that it showed, and he was adaptable, and he made decisions that, when he couldn't get Meade, no one knew where he was. He was able to make decisions that turned out to be the right ones. And I thought that was something that I didn't see that from some of the other people I read. And I thought that was very impressive from someone who didn't necessarily have a classic position.
Yeah. He's important. He's got more than 300 guns under him, but he's the best artillerist in the United States Army during the Civil War. You have the two best artillerists in the war, in Hunt and Alexander here. They're both really good at what they do. So there's a vote for Henry Hunt. Laura.
I thought Meade was good. I thought the essay of him was, very complimentary book, but I think the ability to come in with no credibility and that quickly learn your troops and do well, I thought this was the mark of a great leader.
So you're going to let him off the hook entirely for not pursuing more aggressively after the repulse of the Pickett-Pettigrew assault?
Well, I think, yeah, because I think he was still kind of learning at that point.
All right, Michael?
Make a cautious defense on the more like strategic side of Longstreet, and I think you can definitely dissect his actions on day 2 and say that he made some pretty egregious mistakes. But I think his knowledge and defense of the right actions tactically, in terms of drawing back and whether you move around south exactly or not. The only person that was willing to actually say that to Lee's face and adamantly, clearly he felt that way. Is something to me that to Gouchard's point of your willingness to say and put yourself out of the limb and say this is the opinion.
3 times.
Right. I think very few people would be willing to do that for somebody like Robert E. Lee.
What does that tell us about their relationship?
That they were close,
Yeah.
even if it
Yeah.
was just
Absolutely.
a business relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Lane.
I don't think that necessarily excuses the fact, or him dragging his feet once he, Lee does make the decision, says no, we're going to do this. And he drags his feet for 3/4 of a day, and I don't think that excuses that action at all. So yeah, it's great that he brought it up to him, but ultimately I think his display of leadership, should be okay. Once this is said that we're going to do it this way or we're going to do this, then execute that to the best of your ability.
I would
Brief
say-
rebuttal.
Yeah, I would say I agree. The challenge is if you're Lee likes to breed people who think by themselves and I think you have this fine balance of, do you just want to have somebody who blindly does exactly what I want? But if you really want somebody who's aggressive and thinks on their own, you have to understand that they're going to really struggle when you tell them to do something that they vehemently disagree with. And you have to be aware that maybe making them do that and putting them in that situation isn't the best leadership decision.
Michael?
I'm not responding to that.
You can have your very own idea.
I was actually impressed with Warren, just the foresight, being able to act quickly, see potential, problem at a level higher than himself, and kind of bring forces to bear. It was pretty impressive.
What name has not come up in an hour and a half here? Michael Schar's heart would break if he were in the room. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And you'll see why when you get on Little Round Top, because you're going to see 2 monuments. 3 if you count Patty O'Rourke's bas-relief with his shiny nose, but there are going to be 2 Union officers who have monuments on Little Round Top. Warren has a beautiful one, the most important one, and Strong Vincent has the other one. How about on from this side of the room, which has been quiet since Alex opened this discussion? We've only got 3 minutes left before Michael is going to take over with his iron fist here, so this is the last chance before you actually step onto the field. Yes?
So I've been hesitating to bring it up because I want to make sure it's the right person that I have in mind. But in Killer Angels, there was a scene where the regiment from Maine that refused to fight.
Right, 2nd Maine.
Came down. It was Chamberlain, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought something really struck me about that moment was he really had to decide what to do with this group, and to me, in my reading of it, he was really able to neutralize a lot of their anger by feeding them and treating them like human beings and not reacting immediately with anger and disgust towards them. And I think was able, that was in my mind was a really strong demonstration of leadership, because he was able to get some more out of them.
No, Shara makes a great case through a novelist's perspective of Joshua Chamberlain there. Yeah?
So
Yeah.
that was just one.
Okay.
How historically accurate is that? I mean, obviously we don't know, but is there any record of?
No, there's some. No, it's not. It's not completely made up. It's not completely made up. The 2nd Maine was upset because part of them had enlisted for a certain period and part of them for less. And some were going to get to go home and some weren't going to get to go home. And so it caused hard feelings among them. And it's a nice example of how citizen soldiers are different from regular soldiers, professional soldiers. I mean, and the way he has Chamberlain handled them there, you said he treated them like human beings, but he really treated them like was citizens who were in the Army doing their duty. That's how he treated them. in it, but it's a very effective scene, and it's a good scene in the movie too. It's a nice part of the movie. One very last quick something, if anybody has something here. Yes, Caroline.
I was just gonna say, one of the things that's kind of struck me by all the different readings we've been doing is how there's always two sides of the story. And so while one person seems like they're demonstrating leadership in one situation,
Mhm.
they aren't in another. And so for me, it was really hard to identify one person, because one person that I thought was particularly exemplary might not actually.
Yeah,
I
no.
don't trust my own evaluation
Right.
as having only read
It's
the
hard.
numbers.
Yep. I've noticed that almost nothing that I sent around the room came back, and I want to leave this room with everything that I sent around the room, especially the musket. Michael, it's all yours.
We'll collect them all before you go here.
It's all yours.
So Gary, this is not our last evening with
No,
you.
it's not.
And, but I just want to say, first of all, I'm sorry I couldn't sit in on some of the earlier ones. I missed that.
Thank you.
I got to see most of it on
It's
video.
everything,
And so I would just like to say, before we head up to Gettysburg, thank you for getting us ready for
This is fun.
fantastic experiential. So let's hear from you.